Welcome to Oceanside Chat. I'm Helen Wang, the host and editor of the program. I would like to recognize my many supporters who have been attending our live sessions and listening to our podcast since the first season. I also like to welcome our fast-growing community for season 2. You are the reason why we keep doing what we do. Have you ever wondered what are the relationships between the systems of economic and supply chain? In order to better understand and answer the question, let me begin today's session by sharing a few definitions. First, an economy is the large set of interrelated production, consumption, and exchange activities that determine how scarce resources are allocated. The production, consumption, and the distribution of goods and services are used to fulfill the needs of those living and operating within the economy, which is also referred to as an economic system. A supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product or service to the final buyer. This network includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. The supply chain also represents the steps it takes to get product or service from its original state to the customer. Companies develop supply chains to reduce their costs and remain competitive in the business landscape. According to those definitions, both economy and supply chain study resource management to produce and distribute goods and services. For this episode, I invited an exceptional guest to explore a new concept of the supply chain economy. Please join me to welcome Tom Derry, CEO at Institute for Supply Management and a co-chair of the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at UC San Diego. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Helen. It's really great to be here. I'm proud of the audience we're building. It's fun to see that.
Yeah, that's the most exciting part of our show. I'd like to ask you a few questions to begin with. So besides your CEO title and the LinkedIn profile, what is one thing we don't know about you?
Well, this is an old dinner party trick, and the one I usually use is the fact that I've run 3 marathons. People
wow!
People don't assume that about me. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. I didn't know at all. So thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Well, if you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. Carpentry, maybe.
Oh, really? Why?
Yeah, I love working with my hands, and I think the amount of skill that's required to build, a beautiful piece of furniture or a cabinet. I think most people don't appreciate the amount of skill that's required to do something so well. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, I bet you get a lot of satisfaction by doing that.
Yeah.
Wow. So maybe you shift a little bit to the organization you work for.
Yeah.
Founded in 1915, ISM is the oldest and the largest supply management association in the world. So could you briefly describe ISM and its contribution to the economic data?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We're very proud of it. There's a very interesting history around that. We began publishing economic data for the manufacturing sector of the U.S. economy in 1932 at the request of the Hoover administration. They wanted, we were headed into the Depression. We were in the Depression at that point, and there wasn't good, reliable economic data on production activity in the U.S. economy. And of course, the U.S. economy back then was much more manufacturing-centric than it is today. And the National Association of Purchasing Agents, as it was known back then, NAPA, said, well, we're able to do, the government tried and failed to do it itself. And so the NAPA stepped in and said, well, we can talk, our members will be able to provide that insight. So we've been doing it since then. And interestingly, there was only one interruption. We stopped during World War II because the data on the level of efficiency and productivity in the US economy was a sensitive military secret during the war. And so we didn't publish that data because we didn't want to, show our hands, so to speak, to our enemies during the war. And we resumed after the cessation of hostilities in World War II and have been publishing ever since. In 1998, we launched the services PMI, which covers the services sector of the economy, because the services sector of the economy is actually about 88% of all economic activity in the United States. So not covering the service sector was an obvious gap. And we did that again at the request of the US government. The Commerce Department approached the ISM and said, would you be able to cover the services sector? And we said, sure, we can do that. So we've been publishing that data for more than 20 years. And in fact, we still brief the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the White House privately every single month, just before the data becomes published, because among other things, it's market moving. It moves the capital markets. And both the Fed and the White House have to be prepared in case the markets move dramatically either up or down, and be prepared to take action in that case. So we're very proud of the centrality of the data. And I'll just make one last comment. When you think about the data that we report at ISM, and I can get into some of the technical details at some point, but when we're collecting the data, we're collecting it from people whose job it is to understand the downstream demand they're trying to satisfy with their customers, right? And they're also managing or creating upstream demand in the supply ecosystem. They literally sit at the intersection of supply and demand, and they're trying to reach equilibrium for their own firm. And when you aggregate those insights across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of firms across the United States, you get a very profound look at the movement of GDP, the movement of supply and demand in the economy, and some corollary factors like inflation and so forth. So because of the unique position our members occupy, they have in aggregate a very profound kind of point of view on changes in the US economy.
So you publish now Manufacturing PMI, which is capturing, the supply demand dynamics and actual trend in the manufacturing sector. And you also do Service PMI, which, as you mentioned, now U.S. economy almost 80%, right? GDPs come from segment. And then from your website, you also do a hospital PMI. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's an interesting story there too. So the hospital sector, which is a subsegment of the overall healthcare sector, is very important. Healthcare in the United States comprises almost 20% of GDP, 18 or 19%. So as that sector moves, it has a significant impact on the overall economy. In one of the White House briefings back in June of 2014, I was asked by the staff economists, we could explain why the economy surprisingly went into contraction in the first quarter of 2020. I said, yeah, well, when we reported that, by the way, people didn't believe us. The economy in 2013 had been going very strongly. They thought maybe our data was wrong. Well, turns out our data was accurate, as it always is. And they said, what happened? We got this surprise contraction in the first 2 months of 2014. We don't understand why. And I said, well, we went back and looked at the data. January 1st of 2014 was the first full implementation of the Affordable Care Act, right? Otherwise known as Obamacare. And what happened? Well, you had hospitals and the entire healthcare system completely uncertain about the impact of this new law on their revenue streams. Are we going to be making more money, less money? Nobody really knew. And so what happens when you're uncertain in business? You pump the brakes, right? So you say, all right, no more construction projects. We're not going to backfill those openings on the staff. We're not going to buy that expensive piece of MRI equipment or whatever, right? We just hold off on all those things until we see how things change under the new law. Well, it turns out if you pump the brakes on 20% of the US economy, you get a 2% contraction in the economy like that. So I told the White House, it's obvious to us, the implementation of the Affordable Care Act caused the healthcare sector to be very cautious. And because they were cautious or because they're so big, that had a big impact on the total US economy. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on the hospital sector. Now, coincidentally, we couldn't have, of course, anticipated the pandemic, but we introduced the hospital PMI in August of 2020, when the pandemic sort of really became a serious concern in the United States in March of 2020. And so we were able to chronicle some of the unique pain points of that industry as the pandemic rolled out. You might remember that we put off a lot of our discretionary healthcare services, right? Hospitals were gearing up to deal with these very sick patients. So the acuity of the case mix was very high, very seriously sick people, but we weren't getting the discretionary revenues coming in. So the hospitals had the double whammy of having revenues drop off the table and having to serve a very sick population at the same time. So we kind of had a front row seat at the healthcare sector battling the pandemic as a result.
Mm. Yeah, that's very telling. Sam, could you maybe tell us about the scope of ISM? Like, where do you get your data, and how much that is sort of covered right now?
Economic data is purely in the United States, and people need to understand that. However, the scope of ISM is global. We have members in 80 countries. Maybe 100 countries, actually, I think. We're the largest association in the world. Our next biggest country market outside of the United States is actually the People's Republic of China, followed closely by South Korea. And when you think about global supply chains, those two locations make sense. When we refreshed our certification, we're the largest certifying body in supply chain. When we refreshed our certification a few years ago, we collected data from 2,500 people in 50 different countries, with 720,000 separate data points. So it really is a global view of the profession. And that's what ISM brings to kind of the understanding of supply chains. Now, when it comes to the economic data itself, we cover all 18 sectors of the industrial side of the economy, all 18 sectors of the services. So coincidentally, it happens to be the same number, but it's all 36 sectors of the economy. And we do it in a way that each sector's contribution, each industry sector's contribution, is commensurate with its contribution to overall GDP. So we know that if transportation equipment moves up or down, we know what the impact is going to be on US GDP overall. So for industry verticals is something that we are interested in rolling out more of. We have the hospital PMI now. We're frequently asked for those because we do have particular insight, although we're not publishing it today, on which industries are experiencing growth and which industries are experiencing contraction, and some of the reasons why those industries might be experiencing that.
Yeah, I think those data will be super helpful. And then it's also very telling and symbolic, right? When we're trying to understand the supply chain, just the index that you publish, manufacturing has its own very complicated supply chain services segment as well. And then as well, also apply to, healthcare and maybe every industry, right?
Yeah.
That you're tracking. So no wonder, your monthly announcement of PMI data, I'm sure many people are waiting for it. It will greatly influence investor and business confidence.
Yeah, we have so it's released at 10 a.m. Eastern time on the first business day of the month. That's the manufacturing. On the third business day, we release the services sector, and Wall Street waits for it. And trading activity happens immediately. In fact, back in 2014, again in 2014, so the low latency firms that provide data to the high frequency traders in Wall Street, they publish our data at exactly at 10 a.m. And there was a glitch in that year, and back in June of 2014, I guess it was, and the data was released about 300 milliseconds prior to 10 a.m. in Chicago. And $60 million worth of trades were executed in 300 milliseconds.
Wow.
That's how impactful it is on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And why it's it's humbling. The power and influence of the data we publish is pretty amazing. And so we're taking it very seriously. Right? We can never make a mistake. We know how closely followed it is, and we take a lot of pride in the work that we do there.
Yeah, and you made all of us working in supply chain very proud as well, because we definitely have a big part of role, in terms of the economic impact and growth.
Yeah, I think and I know we're going to talk about it today, but I think since the turn of the century, since the beginning of the 21st century, you could argue the most single important thing in the global macroeconomy is how the global supply chain is operating at any one moment in time. And I think we can talk about some of the reasons why that is the case, but I think many people, because of the pandemic, have begun to appreciate wow, we're really dependent on these other countries, aren't we? And these other suppliers. I
Yeah.
think we as professionals understood that already, but even our government didn't understand the extent to which we were dependent. And certainly
Right.
consumers didn't understand it, but I think they appreciate that now.
Mm-hmm. So maybe this is a good time, to reveal the answer for the poll question on the screen. Let me share the result here. So the question is a single choice question. What percentage of the US economy is contributed by the supply chain and its ecosystem? So we have, let's say the most answer fell in about 70% or more. That's like 30% of the audience voted for that, and 32% saying between 50 to 70. And then 26% saying don't know. Don't know is a good one because we really don't have a clear way to track it, I think, as of today. And then the smallest category is 5%, falling between 10 to 30% of contribution. So Tom, what's your perspective? How do you help us to read this data, and how would you help us to better understand this?
Yeah, I think the people who answered don't know are the wisest respondents for sure, because it's really hard to measure. But one simple way to think about it is how import and export driven is the US economy, especially in comparison to other economies around the world. So it turns out exports only make up about 12% of US GDP. And the value of imports coming into the United States also is about 12%. So one way you could think about it sort of simplistically is that about a quarter of the economy is formally driven by imports and exports flowing into and out of the economy. But that understates the size of the contribution a little bit, because there are some of these components that come in that are re-exported and re-imported. That's certainly the case in industries like automotive, for instance. So if you wanted to think about the level of employment that was supported in the United States by the supply chain industry, you'd have to include industry sectors like distribution and warehousing and logistics. They're not appearing in the import-export data that I just cited, but they're a huge sector of the economy. We've seen the issues that we've had in logistics in the last couple of years, right? Congestion in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. We have a chronic shortage of truck drivers right now. Even railway freight is something that has been a source of issues in the U.S. supply chain in the last couple of years. So if you wanted to think more broadly, probably that answer of 50 to 70% is about right. We have some industries that are heavily, for instance, Boeing is the largest exporter in the United States. It exports high value airplanes to airlines all around the world. And that one company accounts for a large part of U.S. exports. So it really depends on how you measure the contribution overall. And I'll just contrast the U.S. with a couple of other economies. Germany, for instance, 47% of Germany's GDP is driven by exports, right? So it's all those automobile brands that we know, BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, all those brands, all the auto parts that support that industry, all the sophisticated machinery, high-tech manufacturing machinery that they export to manufacturing locations all over the world. They're a heavily export-driven economy, and if something were to interfere with their export opportunities, it would have a severe, outsized, disproportionate impact on their economy. Some other economies are somewhat, 36% is the number for South Korea, so also a very heavily export-dependent economy. And then it moderates a little bit. China's about 18% for exports, so is Japan, and I mentioned the United States is about 12%. So in some ways, the U.S. benefits from being a little bit insulated from the global economic system. Mm-hmm. We've seen during the pandemic that's not totally true, but in comparison to some other countries, we have more resiliency built into the U.S. economy because we're less dependent on our trade relationships with other countries. So
maybe, just a maybe, Tom, that ISM could start a formula or a way to capture, the true supply chain impact to the economic data. That might be something, we would look up to an organization like ISM to come up with something, in addition to the GDP capture that you just described.
Really, really good idea. It's going to take a lot smarter people than me, but we can work on
that. Yeah, I will certainly invite you back, once you have that golden formula for us in the near future.